Just a magnificent looking animal. It's only 3 metres long. Didn't have a mark on it. Gave us an opportunity to tag her, and he placed his tag perfect.
Have you ever looked into the ocean and wondered what was staring back? 200 feet beneath the surface, off the coast of Sicily, a diver was focused on clearing a tangled ghost net wrapped around the rusted remains of an ancient shipwreck. The water was silent. Visibility stretched into an endless blue. Everything seemed routine, until a massive shadow drifted into view. At first, he thought it was another large fish. Then it turned toward him. 13 feet of raw power emerged from the deep, a great white shark in the Mediterranean Sea, a place where encounters this close are extraordinarily rare, and underwater footage of a living great white is almost unheard of. For a split second, time froze. His breathing accelerated. His hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped his camera. Yet he kept filming. What happened over the next 90 seconds stunned marine biologists, conservationists, and millions of viewers across the globe. The footage reignited one of the biggest mysteries surrounding one of Earth's most feared and most misunderstood predators. But before we reveal what that camera captured, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe, because the deeper this story goes, the more it proves the ocean is still hiding secrets that even science hasn't fully uncovered. To understand why this footage sent shockwaves through the diving and scientific community, you first have to understand one simple, almost unbelievable fact. Nobody was supposed to see this shark. Not like this. Not ever. The Mediterranean is technically known habitat for great white sharks. It has been for as long as anyone has kept records. But actual encounters, especially underwater, especially with a diver close enough to look the animal in the eye, are so rare that researchers openly compare the odds to winning the lottery. Most of what scientists currently know about Mediterranean great whites doesn't come from live sightings at all. It comes from dead ones, bodies pulled up accidentally in commercial fishing nets, jaws and fins preserved in glass cases in regional museums, fragments of a population everyone assumes is still out there somewhere, quietly persisting, but almost nobody actually sees. That's the world this story drops into. In the spring, a technical diver named Dirk Remmers was working roughly 50 miles off the coast of Sicily, in the narrow, historically significant stretch of water separating Italy from Tunisia, known as the Strait of Sicily. He wasn't hunting for sharks. He wasn't even thinking about sharks. He was volunteering with an organization called Ghost Diving, a network of specialized technical divers whose entire mission is locating and removing abandoned fishing nets, commonly called ghost nets, from shipwrecks and reefs, before that lost gear can keep trapping and killing marine life indefinitely. It's slow, deliberate, unforgiving work. You're deep. You're tethered to a strict schedule dictated by your air supply and your decompression limits, and your attention is locked entirely onto cutting tangled netting away from twisted, rusted metal, one careful motion at a time, in low visibility, often in murky green-blue light. It is not glamorous. It is not the kind of dive where anyone expects to make history. Divers doing this kind of work spend years, sometimes entire careers, without anything more exciting happening than freeing a trapped grouper or hauling up a rotted net full of crab shells. Nearly 200 feet below the surface, Remmers was doing exactly that kind of unglamorous, careful labor on a shipwreck that marine researchers consider a genuine biodiversity hotspot, the kind of collapsed steel structure that over decades becomes an artificial reef, drawing in schools of fish, moray eels, groupers, sea turtles, and apparently, on this particular day, something far larger than anyone expected. About 3 minutes into the dive, something shifted in the blue water beyond the wreck. A shape emerged out of the haze, not fast, not aggressive, just there, enormous, unmistakable, gliding closer with the kind of effortless, unhurried motion that only an apex predator moves with. The motion of an animal that has never once had to worry about what might be hunting it. A great white shark, roughly 13 feet long, passing close enough that Remmers later estimated the distance at somewhere around 9 feet, close enough to see the animal's eye rotate to track him, close enough to make out every detail of a creature almost nobody in the world had ever filmed alive in these particular waters. His hands, by his own account, were trembling too hard to easily operate the camera. Every diver who has ever prepared for years for a single, once-in-a-lifetime moment knows that feeling, the gap between training and the sheer, overwhelming reality of what's actually happening in front of you. He got the shot anyway. The shark passed by, unhurried, seemingly indifferent to the two small, bubble-exhaling creatures hovering near the wreck, and then it simply turned and dissolved back into the deep blue water beyond, gone as suddenly and calmly as it had appeared. No aggression, no display, just a brief, silent crossing of paths between two very different animals, 3 minutes into an otherwise routine dive. The whole encounter lasted only a matter of moments, but those moments were enough to produce what is now widely believed to be the very first underwater video ever recorded of an adult great white shark in the Mediterranean Sea. To understand exactly why that single sentence is such an enormous deal in the world of marine science, we need to rewind past this dive, past this decade, and go all the way back through the tangled, mysterious, almost forgotten history of the Mediterranean's most elusive predator. A ghost with a history. The Mediterranean and the great white shark have a far stranger, far older relationship than most people realize. This isn't some accidental visitor species that occasionally wandered in through the Strait of Gibraltar and got lost, the way a confused whale sometimes ends up somewhere it shouldn't be. Genetic and historical evidence now suggests great white sharks have called the Mediterranean home for an almost incomprehensible length of time. A landmark genetic study, led by researchers at the University of Bologna, examining DNA extracted from historical shark remains and museum specimens collected over the past 2 centuries, concluded that this population has likely been isolated from other great white shark populations on Earth for roughly 3.2 million years, stretching back to the Pliocene epoch, long before modern humans existed at all. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 3.2 million years. For context, that's older than the earliest stone tools, older than the first members of our own genus, Homo. While continents shifted, ice ages came and went, and entire species rose and vanished, this specific population of sharks has been quietly circling the same enclosed sea, generation after generation, largely cut off from the rest of the species, and the story of how they got there is stranger still. The genetic data suggests Mediterranean great whites are actually more closely related to great white sharks in the Pacific Ocean than to their much closer neighbors in the Atlantic. Researchers believe the ancestors of today's Mediterranean sharks originally traveled across an ancient sea passage connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic. A waterway that existed before the Isthmus of Panama rose up and sealed North and South America together roughly 3.5 million years ago. Once that passage closed, the climate of the Atlantic shifted dramatically, and many marine species that once lived there, possibly including white sharks, died out. Scientists believe the Atlantic was later repopulated by a separate wave of white sharks arriving from somewhere else entirely, likely the waters off southern Africa, which is exactly why today's Atlantic sharks carry different genetic signatures than the ancient, isolated population still living quietly in the Mediterranean. In short, the sharks patrolling the waters off Sicily today aren't distant cousins of the sharks living just a few hundred miles away in the open Atlantic. They're a separate, ancient lineage entirely, one of the oldest and most genetically distinct white shark populations known anywhere on the planet. That isolation is fascinating from a scientific standpoint. But it's also exactly what makes this population so fragile. The same Bologna-led research found something else buried in that ancient DNA, troublingly low genetic diversity among Mediterranean great whites today. A small, isolated population that has been reproducing largely amongst itself for millions of years carries less genetic variation than a larger, more connected one. And low genetic diversity is dangerous. It means harmful mutations can accumulate more easily. It means the population has less built-in resilience to disease, environmental change, or any sudden new pressure. Researchers involved in the study have been blunt about the implication. This is likely a small, endangered community, one that may be far more vulnerable to disappearing entirely than its numbers alone would suggest. For centuries, without any of this genetic context, the Mediterranean world quietly documented encounters with this animal anyway, usually without fully understanding what they were looking at. There are records stretching back to the Middle Ages, describing large, terrifying sharks pulled from these waters or spotted attacking prey close to shore. One dedicated independent researcher has spent decades quietly building a private database of Mediterranean great white sightings, combing through historical fishing records, museum specimens, old paintings and engravings, and first-hand reports from fishermen and divers stretching back hundreds of years. That database has grown to more than 700 documented entries. One of the more striking historical accounts comes from Spain, dated all the way back to the summer of 1862, describing an attack on a swimmer at a beach near Malaga, attributed at the time to what locals called a marajo, almost certainly a great white shark, based on later analysis of the account. It's a chilling reminder that this animal's presence in these waters isn't new, it's ancient. What's new and what's alarming is how rarely anyone actually sees it anymore. Because here's the darker undercurrent running through this entire story. While the historical record shows an animal that was, at various points, almost a routine part of life along Mediterranean coastlines, the modern record shows something closer to a slow, steady vanishing act. Researchers studying the regional population estimate it has declined dramatically over the past several decades. Current assessments suggest the subpopulation has dropped by at least 80% across roughly 3 generations of sharks, which for this particular species stretches across nearly 7 decades of time. Overfishing, accidental bycatch in commercial nets, habitat degradation, and outright persecution driven by the species' fearsome reputation have all been blamed for pushing this ancient population toward the edge of collapse. The broader International Union for Conservation of Nature classifies white sharks globally as vulnerable to extinction. But the Mediterranean's isolated, genetically distinct subpopulation is assessed far more severely. Critically endangered, 1 step above vulnerable, and 1 step below extinct in the wild. Slow reproduction rates make the situation worse. Great white sharks take years to reach sexual maturity, and produce relatively few offspring across a long lifespan, meaning a population this small simply cannot bounce back quickly from sustained losses, even if the pressure on it eased today. Which is exactly why sightings like the one off Sicily carry so much scientific weight. Every confirmed live encounter is treated less like a curiosity and more like a rare, precious lifeline of information about a population that might be quietly slipping away without anyone fully realizing the scale of it. Consider the scattered pattern of Mediterranean encounters in recent memory. In 2018, off the Balearic island of Cabrera near Mallorca, a Spanish marine conservation group reported spotting a roughly 16-foot great white shark, the first confirmed sighting in Spanish waters in almost 3 decades. More recently, a young great white was accidentally caught in Spanish Mediterranean waters, small enough that researchers estimated its length at under 7 feet and its weight at under 200 pounds. That single incident sparked a fresh wave of historical research, with scientists pouring back through documented sightings and reports dating all the way back to 1862, eventually cataloguing over 60 separate documented occurrences in Spanish waters alone, many of them clustered curiously around the Balearic Islands. That same research pointed towards something else intriguing, a possible connection between shark movements and the migration patterns of Atlantic bluefin tuna, suggesting these sharks may be following a major prey species through Mediterranean waters at certain times of year. If true, that would mean protecting bluefin tuna populations could have a direct, measurable knock-on effect on protecting the sharks that follow them. These sightings are scattered, rare, and precious, separated sometimes by years, sometimes by entire decades, and virtually all of them share one thing in common. They happen at the surface, a fin cutting through open water, a shadow glimpsed briefly from the deck of a boat, a carcass hauled up accidentally in a fishing net, studied only after the animal is already dead. Almost never does anyone see one of these sharks underwater, alive, moving freely through its own environment, the way Dirk Remmers did off the coast of Sicily. That's precisely what made this particular encounter different from nearly every other Mediterranean great white sighting in recorded history. And it's exactly why, the moment that footage surfaced publicly, marine scientists across the region sat up and took immediate notice. Why this sighting matters. When the footage from the Strait of Sicily reached researchers, the reaction wasn't just excitement. It was something closer to relief, mixed with a fresh sense of urgency. According to a researcher affiliated with a marine science center in Sicily who studies the region's shark populations, most of what's currently known about Mediterranean great whites has historically come from dead specimens, animals accidentally caught and killed during fishing operations, then examined and catalogued after the fact. Live observations, especially detailed, high-quality underwater footage like this, are treated as extraordinarily valuable because they offer a rare, direct window into how these animals actually move, behave, and use their habitat in real time. Information a dead specimen pulled from a net simply cannot provide, no matter how carefully it's studied. The location itself carried real scientific significance too. The Strait of Sicily, the relatively narrow, biologically rich channel separating Italy and Tunisia, is considered by some researchers to be one of the last true strongholds for the Mediterranean's dwindling great white population. It's a natural crossroads of currents and migratory routes, a historically important fishing ground for centuries, and now apparently still a corridor where an animal presumed to be almost gone is quietly passing through, largely unseen and unrecorded. There's also the matter of the shipwreck itself, and why divers were even down there in the first place. The reason ghost diving volunteers were 200 feet underwater that day wasn't the shark. It was cleanup, removing lost fishing nets from wrecks that, left unattended, become unintentional death traps disguised as thriving ecosystems. Fish, turtles, and countless other marine animals get tangled and drowned in gear that nobody ever came back to retrieve. Conservationists estimate that somewhere between 3 and 10% of all fishing gear used worldwide each year ends up lost at sea, left behind to keep trapping and killing marine life indefinitely, unless someone physically dives down and removes it by hand. In other words, this shark showed up during an active act of environmental repair. A small team of volunteer divers, spending their limited bottom time restoring a damaged patch of ocean floor, happened to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right depth, at exactly the right moment, to witness something almost nobody believed still existed in these waters, let alone in these numbers. The organizers behind the dive were quick to frame the encounter within that bigger picture. It wasn't just about capturing a viral clip of an impressive predator. It was proof, rare, tangible, undeniable proof that despite decades of decline, despite pollution, overfishing, and the well-documented disappearance of so much Mediterranean marine life, there is still enough biodiversity left in these offshore waters to draw in and sustain one of the ocean's most demanding apex predators. That single detail reframes the entire story. This isn't merely a shark sighting, it's a small, hopeful signal of life in a sea that conservationists have spent years warning is dying by inches, one degraded reef and one lost fishing net at a time. And the diver at the center of it all seemed to understand that significance almost immediately. In the moments after the encounter, still visibly processing what had just happened, Remmers described the odds of a moment like this in blunt, almost disbelieving terms, comparing the statistical likelihood of the encounter to winning a lottery jackpot, a comparison that quickly spread alongside the footage itself once it was released to the public and picked up by outlets around the world. Researchers were careful, however, to add an important note of caution to the excitement. A single, rare sighting, however remarkable, doesn't automatically mean the population is recovering. Scientists studying the phenomenon have pointed out that climate change often redistributes marine species rather than genuinely increasing their numbers. As Mediterranean waters warm and prey, species shift their own ranges in response. Sharks may simply begin appearing in places or at times of year where they were historically less common, without the underlying population actually growing at all. In other words, more sightings could mean more sharks, or it could mean the same small, struggling population is simply becoming easier to stumble across as everything around it changes. The shark itself. So what exactly was swimming through that wreck? Based on size estimates drawn from the footage, researchers placed the animal at roughly 13 feet in length, a substantial, mature individual, almost certainly an adult male. That detail matters more than it might first appear, because adult great whites in general are far less frequently observed by researchers worldwide than juveniles. Encountering a fully grown adult, at depth, in open water, in a region where sightings of any kind are already scarce, pushes this footage into genuinely rare territory even by the standards of great white shark research on a global scale. Great white sharks are by nature wide-ranging, restless animals. Elsewhere in the world, individuals are known to migrate staggering distances across entire ocean basins, crossing thousands of miles of open water in pursuit of seasonal prey. They don't respect the tidy boundaries humans draw on maps. For years, that basic biological fact made the idea of a population existing quietly, semi-permanently, within the smaller, semi-enclosed waters of the Mediterranean seem almost implausible to some researchers. The Mediterranean connects to the wider Atlantic Ocean only through the narrow bottleneck of the Strait of Gibraltar, a relatively small doorway for an animal capable of crossing entire oceans. But the genetic evidence has settled that question. This is indeed a distinct, largely self-contained group, one that has adapted over millions of years to a smaller, more enclosed range than its wide-ranging relatives elsewhere on the planet. And that long-term isolation is part of exactly what makes the population so vulnerable today. A shark population confined largely to one relatively small, heavily fished, heavily trafficked sea doesn't have the option of simply swimming away from human pressure into some untouched corner of the ocean. Every abandoned fishing net, every stretch of degraded coastline, every disruption to the Mediterranean's food weblands directly and disproportionately on this one specific, ancient, irreplaceable group of animals. There's also a quieter, more technical complication buried inside all of this research. Scientists note that juvenile great whites in the region can sometimes be mistaken for another critically endangered species found in the same waters, the short-fin mako shark, and the confusion is known to run in both directions. That means some historical sighting reports scattered across the centuries may be less reliable than they first appear, and it also means confirmed high-quality footage like this becomes even more scientifically valuable because it eliminates any doubt whatsoever about exactly which species researchers are looking at. Watching the raw footage itself, the shark's behavior looks almost unnervingly calm. It doesn't lunge. It doesn't circle aggressively. It doesn't display any of the frantic, threatening body language typically associated with predatory interest. It simply glides past, seemingly untroubled by the presence of two divers working quietly nearby, before turning away on its own terms and vanishing back into open water. For an animal so thoroughly mythologized in popular culture as a mindless, relentless killing machine, the reality captured on camera looks far closer to simple indifference, a massive, supremely efficient predator calmly passing through its own ancestral territory, largely unconcerned by the sudden presence of two small, air-bubbling intruders. That contrast, the terror of the reputation versus the calm of the reality, is a huge part of what makes this footage so compelling to watch, and so useful to researchers trying to correct decades of exaggerated fear surrounding this species. It doesn't look like a horror movie, it looks like a wild animal, thousands of generations deep in its own corner of the sea, simply going about its day in a stretch of water it has probably called home for far longer than human civilization has existed anywhere nearby. What happens next? So where does all of this leave the story of the Mediterranean's great white sharks? On one hand, the underlying science remains sobering. This is still one of the most endangered shark populations documented anywhere on the planet, hammered by decades of overfishing, habitat degradation, and accidental capture in commercial fishing gear, all compounded by millions of years of genetic isolation that left the population with dangerously little diversity to draw on. Best current estimates still suggest a population that has collapsed dramatically compared to where it likely stood even a century ago, let alone 3 million years ago when this lineage first arrived in these waters. On the other hand, this footage, however brief, however lucky, however statistically improbable, is a genuine data point of hope. It proves that at least some of these animals are still out there, still healthy enough to reach an impressive adult size, still moving calmly through historic strongholds like the waters around Sicily, exactly as their ancestors likely have for millions of years. For researchers, encounters like this one are treated as precious, hard-won puzzle pieces in a much larger, mostly incomplete picture. Every confirmed sighting adds a little more to a slowly growing understanding of where these ancient sharks still travel, what kinds of habitats they still depend on, and what conservation efforts might actually make a measurable difference in protecting whatever population remains today. Organizations working in the region have pointed directly to encounters like this one as justification for continuing habitat protection work, pushing for expanded and better enforced fishing gear regulations and further scientific monitoring of historic hotspots like the Strait of Sicily and the waters around the Balearic Islands. Marine biologists studying the population also stress how much remains genuinely unknown. Researchers still can't say for certain how far individual Mediterranean sharks typically range within the sea, where the species' critical nursery areas might be located, or exactly how much genetic exchange, if any, still occurs with sharks beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Answering those questions is complicated by exactly the same problem this entire story revolves around: a wide-ranging apex predator that almost never allows itself to be observed. There's also a quieter, more human lesson buried in how this particular footage came to exist in the first place. It wasn't captured by some large, well-funded research expedition built specifically around the goal of finding a shark. It was captured by volunteers doing unglamorous, thankless cleanup work, freeing a forgotten wreck from decades of tangled fishing line, simply trying to make one small patch of ocean a little healthier than they found it. The shark appeared almost as an unplanned reward for that quiet, unseen effort, a reminder that protecting marine ecosystems, even in small, unglamorous, thankless ways, keeps the door open for extraordinary, once-in-a-lifetime moments like this to happen at all. Somewhere off the coast of Sicily, in the blue water beyond a forgotten shipwreck, there's a shark still moving through the Mediterranean the way its ancestors have for roughly 3.2 million years, mostly unseen, mostly unknown, quietly surviving in a sea that has, in just the last century, pushed its ancient, irreplaceable lineage to the very edge of extinction. For 90 seconds, one trembling diver with a camera caught a glimpse of that long, silent survival. And for the first time in the entire recorded history of underwater exploration, the rest of the world finally got to see it too. If this story reminded you that the ocean still has secrets left to give up, ancient ones, fragile ones, ones we're only just beginning to understand, there's more waiting beneath the surface. Subscribe and we'll go looking for the next one together.